Welcome everyone to the latest edition of Talking Data. I'm your host, Kristen Radish with Arbor Research and Trading, joined today by our commentator, Sam Rines of Arbor Data Science. Welcome, Sam.
Good morning.
Today, Sam will discuss life expectancy, the population boom, and their implications. Sam, the 20th century saw radical advancements across a host of technologies, from horses to automobiles to planes. The developments created tailwinds for the US and the global economy. Today, we want to look at two data points, the life expectancy and population boom. In 1900, life expectancy was 47.3, and by the turn of the century, it was 76.8. What does this mean?
Yeah, I think this is a radically overlooked tailwind to the U.S. economy and global economy more broadly. But it's also kind of an interesting story for the labor force as well. Today we consider prime age workers 25 to 55. I mean, and in the start of this, the 20th century. There weren't that many people that actually made it through the prime working years. That was a tremendous tailwind to the overall global economy as we progressed through the 20th century. When you have that type of tailwind, it's really hard to describe how that changes an economy, right? You go from having a relatively short time frame, right? You join the labor force in your teens, you have a much lower level of educational attainment on average, and by the time you're 50, you're lucky to still be alive. I mean, that's a pretty radical kind of thing to think about today. Today we think of, okay, when you graduate high school, are you going to go to college? Are you going to become a doctor? I mean, doctors, that's kind of into your early 30s before you're really out there. So it was a significant pivot in the way that the U.S. global economy and the overall labor force conducted itself. And as you emerge from World War II, you began to have, call it a post-industrial era of the US economy, where more and more workers did things within the services industry that doesn't have the physical requirement of call it a construction or manufacturing job or agrarian job. It's much easier on the body. It allows you to work for a much longer period of time, and therefore you have a longer earning span. You have a longer time to save. You have more spending power, etc. Not to mention the incredible tailwind of women joining the labor force as well as we kind of got to the latter part of the 19th century. I mean, these are tailwinds that they don't happen every day, and they all seem to happen pretty simultaneous to one another, or at least in conjunction with one another, to create one of the more powerful tailwinds we've seen. And life expectancy today is it's expected to move higher, but it's not expected to move at anywhere near the clip that we had over the last century. So while we might live longer and might have better lives, it's not going to be quite the same as moving from mid 40s to almost 80.
And Sam, how about the population boom that has occurred during the same time period? Is that continuing? Is it expected to continue? Who's leading the pack?
Yeah, it's interesting. So obviously it's not the EU that's going to be leading the pack. I mean, that's one of the easier ones to kind of point to and say this is in decline. But it's worth noting that one of the major population booms that was also one of the easier ways to outsource manufacturing, particularly for the United States, was the China population boom. Right, a large number of people there created a labor force that was rather cheap on a global labor market. Right, we could outsource our manufacturing, we could get cheap goods back. That was a wonderfully deflationary force for a very long time. We're likely past peak China population, and likely to continue to see at least a flatlining, if not a decline, as we move forward. That is a sea change in the way that things were put together. Globally, India is the one really interesting place for population here. Population is very slow moving. It's pretty easy to kind of get a pretty good feel for what's going to happen there. And India is not expected to peak for another 30 to 40 years in terms of its population. at a very large, north of 1.6 billion people. That's a market that I think has been somewhat overlooked in terms of what will the consumer look like with 1.6 billion people in a democracy in Asia, versus what did a population of 1.2 billion people look like in a, call it, command and control economy in Asia. I think that's going to be a really interesting long-term story of, maybe there's something there that people haven't picked up on yet. The U.S. isn't expected to have a population implosion like Europe or China, but it's more of a steady state 1 to 2% type gain over the next 30 to 50 years. That's a good thing, right? That should help the United States economy continue to grow, continue to be prosperous, but also not be as inflationary as call it an India population boom might be. India's population is expected to grow by a significant amount, basically the United States, and China's is expected to shrink by the United States. That I think is radically underappreciated in terms of the way that we put together the global economy, whether it's commodity prices, whether it's oil demand, energy demand. There's going to be some pretty interesting changes over the next 30 to 40 years in terms of where's most important, who's demanding the most on the margin, and who may actually see demand declines over time.
So you've touched on this, but what are the main consequences that we should watch for?
I think one of the more interesting ones is China's unlikely to be an exporter of deflation going forward. China was, the world's greatest deflation exporter for the last 15 to 20 years. That's likely come to an end when you don't have the labor force that's growing at those rates. You tend to have a slowing, and that's problematic to having lower wages, right? They're going to have a labor shortage, not a labor boom. And we've seen in the US what a labor shortage can do, right? It can push wages up, and it can push wages up significantly in a short time frame. So China's likely to be more of an exporter of inflationary pressures, not deflationary pressures, at least over the, call it, medium term. Whereas there's a possibility of India maybe becoming the next big manufacturing and services boom hub that could be a source of the next big place to offshore, et cetera. It's already a fairly significant place for services to be offshored. But I think that's really the consequence here, is that the era of deflation of goods manufacturing is likely over, and you're likely to see much more volatility on that side.
Sam, thank you for your thoughts today. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions about this podcast or Arbor Research, Bianco Research, or Arbor Data Science, you can contact us by emailing Gus Handler at gus.handler@arborresearch.com. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.